And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful. So
And
we're picking up with part two of Let's
we
Get
have
Organized.
returned. Yes, welcome back to Dream Idiots. We're heading back into part two of Morris's story from last week. If you listened to last week, hopefully you did the homework assignment and watched that documentary, that BBC documentary on YouTube.
But
Go ahead.
yeah, YouTube, if you haven't and you're just slacking in the back of the class, that's fine too. We'll try to keep everything up to pace so we can figure out what's going on. But if you haven't listened to part one, you might want to go back and do that, just so we're all on the same page regarding what we're trying to talk about here with the way we organize in pecking orders and social orders. So, Bryan, you got to watch Boys Alone. And
I did.
just to recap, it's about 10 boys left alone in one house for 5 days. They're 11 to 12 years old. They've each had a cooking course. There's a camera crew there during the day with stationary cameras at night. They always have access to their parents via phone. Production crew is there, psychologists, and a nurse is on call in case things get out of hand. This came out in 2002, directed by Kim Flitcroft, and it is called Boys Alone. So, Bryan, what'd you think about this
Frankly,
documentary?
it was not as ugly as I thought it might get. When I after after we recorded the last one, I quickly went on Google and just Googled it, and one of the links to it actually referenced Lord of the Flies, which was my joke about it in the first place. Because it's eerily similar in many respects because it's only 5 days, but it is absolute fucking chaos in the first hour when these kids get into this house. It's just completely bonkers, and I find it to be quite stressful. I was like anxious, like how bad is this going to get? Because is someone going to be injured? What's going to happen here? It was awful.
So the boys, as a quick rundown, here's just some names. George was the elected leader. Then there was Sim, who was a smaller kid, vegetarian. Daniel was a big, confident kid. There was Michael, who was small, very hyper. He became the outcast. There was Luke, who's another vegetarian. There was Sam. All I have by him is the ginger kid. He was the redhead. And then there was Robert, who I think was the blonde crew cut kid. Alex had the glasses. And then there were Paul and Mark, who didn't really appear too terribly much in it. I just remember their names. So what I was going to do is go day by day, very briefly, as to how things kind of broke down literally. So they spent the first hour getting to know each other and the grounds of the house, right? They kind of explored the house, explored the backyard, and getting to know each other and kind of figuring things out. And within 1 or 2 hours, they were literally painting on the walls. There was sticky popcorn ground into the carpet. And the thing that got me going were the water guns. And they just brought the water guns out and just started waylaying each other. And all this started around really right when they got there at 10:30 in the morning. And what I love is they cut to immediately 12 hours later. Yeah, we need to get somebody to lead us because this is not working. And that's when they held their election on day one and they elected George. What did you think of George?
It was pretty clear from the get-go that he was likely to be, at or near the top, because he definitely had a certain, I don't know, gravitas, which is sort of a ridiculous term to use for an 11-year-old, but he definitely seemed to have more whatever about him. He had the carriage of a leader, sort of. So it wasn't surprising at all to me that he was the one who was elected.
Yeah, and he didn't seem particularly. As you learn more about him, the more things descended into chaos, the more I kind of liked him because he was trying to hold things together. Day two rolls around, and the narrator notes there's still been no organized meal, and that everybody's basically high on sugar. Cleaning has become a problem, and coverage of the group, basically group discussion, focuses on Sim because Sim apparently has not been doing his job helping out cleaning up. Sim gets homesick, and then some boys start to pick on him. And then there's that just horrific scene where he's in the tent and they're just kicking soccer balls left and right at him while he's trying to sleep. And George, as a leader, is trying to defend him, right? So we're already seeing things kind of start to break down, and certain kids are fulfilling certain roles. We get to day three. Day 3 starts off with the chocolate bit, which is one of my favorite parts in the whole thing, where the kid comes in and he says, like, how can you eat chocolate at 9 a.m? And the
I'm
other kid
hungry.
responds, I'm hungry. Fair enough. I do love their Britishness in it, that if it had been American kids, it would have been just F
Right.
this and F that and F you, and just from the get-go, but they still have this, that's not proper, just kind of
Right.
demeanor
Right.
to it. The boys meet formally to discuss Sim's cleaning duties. And by day 3, they've put up an inflatable pool, which the narrator notes is the closest thing to a proper wash the most of the boys have had, so they've gotten there. And then Luke, Paul, and Daniel step forward and decide that they need a communal meal, which is really interesting to me, that these guys step forward and say, hey, we'll cook. We need to get everybody together. And I think that's when my favorite insult of the entire show comes out, when he calls him a prat. You prat, you're the biggest prat I've ever seen.
Right. Only English kids would use
Yeah.
that as an insult.
And this is when the narrator first makes a note of the pecking order, which is what we talked about last time.
Right.
And if we think back to our original 4 roles that we've seen, we had the leader, the bully, the nerd or the outcast, and then we had the joker in the bunch. So, I don't want to go through what each kid does. George is clearly the leader because he was elected that way, but like you said, he had some kind of personality trait that allowed him to take that role. I think Daniel has kind of filled the role of the bully. Big kid,
Mhm. Right.
really kind of mean. There's a couple of different. Sim is clearly the kid getting picked on. Michael is also an outcast. He's the smaller kid who's really super hyper.
Right.
As for the Joker in the bunch, I mean, they're all kind of funny. I think it's Sam that calls the guy the prat. I'm not sure, but they all have a pretty good sense of humor about things. But we do start to see this breakdown almost into tribal arrangements. The boys participate then, after this, in the feminization of names, which makes sense. Growing up, I remember the last thing you wanted to be seen in a group of boys is effeminate. And so they started calling each other Pauline and Georgina. And do you remember that part? And Danielle, and just they started doing that bit. And then Sim seems to come around to be made to clean up everything after the meal, since apparently one of the things about Sim is that it seems like he really wasn't doing any cleaning whatsoever. He'd go off and goof off when everybody else was trying to work. But day 3 is when things really start to kind of fall apart. Michael is really cast into the role of the outcast, the nerd, the troublemaker. And when I look at Michael, I see a kid who probably has some kind of hyperactivity disorder.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, he destroys quite a few things in there. He's clearly got some things roiling beneath the surface he's trying to work out. But we start to see some first real signs of what you called, and what the review you looked at called, Lord of the Flies type behavior. They actually call for a whipping of Michael. They tie him to a chair. And I mean, it's not quite as bad as Piggy, but it's close, right? For Lord of the Flies. And by 9 o'clock that night of day 3, the boys have broken down into 2 tribes, the loud and the quiet, with the loud taking the large room and the quiet taking the small. Michael continues to act out in very odd behavior, says that he wants to scream until I lose my voice, which is very sad and very, quite disturbing. But I think also what we see here is this idea that once a group gets too large, you're going to have that kind of breakdown. And maybe that's why the scientists way back in 1979 had the cabins of only 4 boys each. Because if you start, and maybe that totally negates my idea of maybe you should have more roles for the boys, because once you get past a certain size, the group becomes unmanageable.
Right. Sure.
And here you're dealing with a group that's 2.5 times as large as what they were dealing with in the first sociological experiment. Now, day 4, from a film standpoint, that's the one that starts with the long, slow shot through the wrecked house. You just remember the insanity of the paint is everywhere. The kitchen is a mess. There's just everything seems to be destroyed. And Michael is being blamed for pretty much all of it. And Robert, who's been really quiet and not much of a player in this, suggests beating Michael up. which all of a sudden goes from like 0 to 60. It's like, oh my goodness, we don't hear from you. And then all of a sudden it's like, I say we just smack him around a bit.
Right. Bash his brains in, right?
And this is really just the second time, because I think Sim requests to talk to his parents on day 1 or 2. By 3 p.m., the boys consult with the staff over Michael's situation. So they turn to adults, they turn to leadership to figure out what to do about the Michael situation. And they all seem to have turned on Michael, but by the time they're done with the psychologist, they agree that they all played a part in the destruction, which is clearly true,
Right,
because
right.
we've seen them do it.
Right.
And then in the saddest part, to me, and the saddest part of it is that Michael kind of curls up into a ball, almost in a fetal position on the bed, and just no longer communicates with the rest of the boys.
Mm-hmm.
And George and one of the others, I think it's Alex, try to talk to him. He just doesn't want to hear it.
Right. Just shuts down.
Shuts down. And then comes the hedgehog hunt, which to me was like, oh, here we go. And fortunately, the crew stepped in at that point, because it's like, what are these boys going to do left alone with a poor hedgehog? That hedgehog's not going to make it. We all know that. And by 3 a.m., the noisy, quiet tribal war starts up again on day 4. And then by day 5, things get really dark. The boys get very serious about the war between the rooms. There's one kid, I think it's Sam, who trades. The groups go from 5-on-5 to 6-on-4 because Sam keeps trading sides. There's a lot of homophobia, slurs, mom jokes, or what passes for mom jokes with these kids, and just utter destruction throughout the house. I mean, they're going down the stairs on cardboard slides. And then my favorite bit was when the one kid is putting styrofoam through a cheese grater. It's like, you little shit. Do you know how hard that's going to be to clean up? And then we get to day 6, and then the boys are kind of really forced to look in on themselves. Oh my God, what did we do? What have we wrought? And I love the parents' reactions. Hey, what'd you do?
The parents show up to pick up their kids, peer in the window. It's like, what? Why did you do this? I mean, it was that house. I mean, whoever owned that damn property. I mean, that house had 6 months of abuse in 5 days.
It was
6 years. Hell, I mean, it's just awful.
It would need total recarpeting, probably stripped
down at the studs, right?
Stripped down to the studs and totally redone. And the parents were, I mean, truly in the word awe, where awe suggests like wonder and terror at the same time. Like, right. Oh my God, this
rubbernecking is like, yeah,
this came out of my child. Right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a review here from a gal called Snapper1 on IMDb. And then I just kind of want to talk generally about the pecking order and where it comes from, and wrap up with a few things as it pertains to this particular documentary. Snapper1 wrote, so if you're into horror movies, sci-fi with lots of destruction, gory phantasms, Creature from the Black Lagoon, or Night of the Living Dead type situations, then by all means, you'll thoroughly enjoy the psychological thriller. It was made for you. Because there is a certain anxiety, and even you mentioned it early on, that there is this anxiety of, oh, when are these, I mean, and the researchers is like, when are you going to step in? I mean, when are you going to step in? Because clearly what this Michael kid is going through is, but then again, this was made 20 years ago.
Right.
So maybe there's a bit more tolerance, or a bit more, I don't know, I don't want to say ignorance, but a little bit more latitude in what can a kid take in terms of like psychological trauma. But clearly that Michael kid was hurting and needed to get out of that situation, in my opinion. But what do we do about the inherent cruelty of the pecking order, and can we do anything about it? Is one of the things that I wonder about, because we have not only the natural pecking order that we've seen go on, say, in this documentary, but we also have the hierarchical pecking order that is imposed upon us through, say, rank, through management, through various, even in the church, has a certain pecking order as to how we succeed or fail within a societal structure. So what do we do about that in what